Hello, welcome back to my channel. If you've just joined me from the StudyTube project, then hey. If you have not just joined me from the StudyTube project, then part one of this video was on that channel and is up. Go and watch that first because it's the important part. So in this half of the video we are going to be talking about general writing tips. We will be discussing the introduction and conclusion in detail because they are actually quite hard, even though a lot of people say, oh, they're the easiest bit. I really disagree. We will also be discussing referencing the Harvard style. I don't have any experience of any other referencing style, I'm sorry, but as far as I'm aware, a lot of my friends have used Harvard, so I'm just going to talk about that and any general tips that I think of on the way. An introduction, in my opinion, is one of the hardest bits of an essay to write. You might disagree, but I really struggle with starting. Just getting going, I think, and not knowing how to begin is a really difficult part of the process, and I sympathise with you completely. If it is giving you a major block and causing stress, then don't feel like you have to do it first. If you've done a good enough plan, it might be quite nice to do the introduction and just try and get your head around what you're writing, but if it is making you stressed, then do it later. Do a paragraph that you think you've kind of got sussed first to build your confidence. There's no right or wrong way to write an essay, as long as you've done drafts afterwards to go back and check that it does actually form a coherent structure. When you're writing an introduction, the very first thing that you need to do is definitions. If your essay doesn't open up describing what it is you're actually talking about, then it's not an introduction. I'm going to put a few of my introductions on the screen for the next minute or so, and you can see how in every single one of them I have done a definition first. No matter what it's about, I've picked out words that I think are keywords and made sure that I've explained what those words mean. The best places to get these definitions are not the dictionary. It is academic books and articles. It does mean that you might have several definitions that different people have said. That is okay. I would try and pick one that you think is the best. Explain why, but very quickly. And if you want to present 2 or 3, then go for it. Sometimes you might have a 2-part introduction, and one whole part of the introduction might be discussing an issue with definitions. So for example, in this ritual essay, a whole part of the essay was actually discussing the problem with the word ritual, like what does it mean. I'm thinking of doing a whole nother video comparing my worst essay and my best essay and explaining why they're my worst and my best. So if you want that, then give me a thumbs up. The main body of any essay is going to be discussing your argument and what you have learned, what this means, how this backs up your argument that you've taken, because it doesn't matter really what you're arguing in an essay, as long as you have grasped the texts well enough and engaged with them to a high level. And how you engage with them is you sort of sum up what they're saying, but then you critique them. You bring in other people to critique them. You talk about their strengths, weaknesses, and essentially what you think about what they're saying. Is it a load of rubbish? That's a bit colloquial, but there are, fancier ways of saying that's a load of rubbish. For example, a phrase that I like to use is, I would argue that said text is perhaps, and then go on to explain why you think it's bad. An example here is in an essay that I've written about Neanderthals. I didn't agree with a certain author and I said I would argue that such and such is perhaps catering to a romanticised audience. He is basically, what he's saying is a bit of a reach, and I disagree. And what I would then do is bring in an alternative. So I would say such and such on the other hand, blah blah blah, or such and such agrees, they argue that, So you're forming a complex argument by building it up in layers instead of simply putting for against, obviously it depends on what your title is, but just as a general, link it in. So you could have one paragraph with for and against, one paragraph that is simply against, one is simply for, then a bit of both. But having more of a complex structure is much better and is much higher level, as long as you do still have your linking phrases in the last and the first line of each paragraph, so that it makes sense as to why you're introducing things in a certain order. On that note, your opinion is totally valid. Don't be scared of saying I would argue that, or you know, I believe that, because I think it's at GCSE and A level you sort of encourage not to do that, whereas at university everyone does that. You get more freedom to show your academic understanding, I think, and don't be afraid to do that. Just don't use one thinks that, because who is one? You know, I got a comment on one of my essays that essentially said, who is one? If one is you, don't be afraid to write I. Is this your opinion? Be proud of your opinion, present it as you. There's no point trying to disguise it, just do it. All I would say is make sure, if you're going to put an opinion forward, that you've grasped the topic, like if you've read enough things, and try and form opinions just about the articles that you've read. So like the validity of the source, like comment on the authors, and you get a little bit higher grades. Right, the conclusion. You might think again, the conclusion's easy, why would that stress you out? Now believe me, it stresses me out. You've just written a whole essay, you come to the conclusion and you're a bit done at that point, aren't you? A line I often start with is, in sum, this essay has argued that, and that line is going to be very similar to the one that you brought in your introduction, which basically puts across your overall argument. If you've argued multiple things, then by all means reference them, but I would, as a general rule for an essay, choose one line of argument. There is no point having like 3 lines of argument in an essay, because it's just going to be too much, especially in a 2,000 word essay. You haven't got the time or the words to make 3 arguments good. Choose one. Do make sure that it corresponds to the introduction and main body. Don't be arguing something that you didn't actually argue in the text. It's not a conclusion, you've just brought in a new argument for no reason, you know? No new material, no new arguments should be in the conclusion. That is a strict rule that I'm giving you. Don't bring anything new in the conclusion, unless it is suggestions for new research. We'll come on to that. So make sure it's coherent with the main body. Do list a few of the sources that you've read. So I argued that, blah blah blah. For example, such and such. You could then also suggest someone else and say, however, I discussed that this was an invalid source. Sources that I would put more weight on are blah blah blah. And then at the end of your conclusion, it is really good to talk about any future research that might be useful. I would probably just leave it as an interesting new area of research would be. By having a suggestion for further research or inquiry, it does tie up the end of your essay quite nicely into a little bow, and also shows that you've engaged further with the topic than is expected of you. And we get to the final part of the video, referencing. However, this should not be the final part of your essay, and that's going to be one of my tips. I'm not going to teach you how to reference in this section. If you would like a video on that, then leave me a comment. But I'm just going to give some general pointers about things that I have done wrong regularly, and other people's work that I have looked through for them have done wrong. So the first tip, which I just touched on, is to not leave them all to the end. You will get stressed. It's something that a lot of people forget and leave to the last minute, and there's no need for it at all. If you input your references as you go along, as you mention that source, then it is so much easier when you come to the end. Like when you've finished, you've finished. You don't have an extra half an hour's work to do by putting your references in. And I'm talking about Harvard again, that's all I've had experience with. So basically tip number 1 for referencing is, as soon as you have put a little name in brackets, get it in your bibliography. Tip number 2 is just some kind of writer's etiquette. Make sure you have a comma after the surname and before the date. So you have name, comma, space, date. If you're really struggling for words, sometimes delete the space. And then your reference is 1 word instead of 2. Do check with your supervisors if that's allowed, because I don't want you to lose marks because of that. So just check first. Oh, do you know what you could do is actually put like a white letter as the space, and then it's 1 word but you've still got a space. When you are doing et al. References, make sure you have got a full stop after al and a comma after the full stop, so it will look like this. I did not know this until I did my dissertation. Just hadn't been told, didn't have a clue. But et al. Dot, comma, space, date. If you have more than 1 reference, so if you're going to reference like a sentence but you've used 2 different books or articles for that 1 sentence, list them both, but do them in alphabetical order. So say 1 is Joe Blogs, do Blogs 2012, then a semicolon, then Jones 2014. Some tutors might like it in date order, but the vast majority of ones that I've had a lot of tutors, and the vast majority want it alphabetical because that is how your actual bibliography reads as well. If you have a single reference that is 3 people but is not written as et al. In like the actual bibliography bit, just make it an et al. Because there's no point wasting your words by writing 3 people's names. A cheeky tip that again I didn't know until far too late in my university career is that you don't have to alphabetically order your references yourself. I'm gonna do like a screen share of this because it's hard, isn't it? I'll just write a load of random sentences because it doesn't really matter what they say. I'm doing it right now. So all you do, highlight them and click this button. It has an A and a Z on it. Click that and it sorts it in paragraphs. Select paragraphs because each paragraph is going to be a reference. Just make sure you have a space between each reference vertically. I think that makes sense. And then press OK and it orders them all in alphabetical order. Ta-da! And that is the end of the video. I hope it was helpful, and if you haven't already watched part 1, then I really would recommend doing that because I talk about planning and structure and they are the most important parts of the essay, so I will link that in a pinned comment. Go check that out. If you like this video, if you want more essay tips, give me a thumbs up, and any feedback, any tips from your own writing, please do write them down because this is a collaborative effort. We all have different ways of doing things and we all learn from each other, so leave them in the comments. Subscribe to my channel if you don't already, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!